The Federalist, Lesson 4, Men and Angels. Gene was asking before you all came in about how many more we would have on this. There's 85 of them. We're not doing all 85 of them. We're doing them in groupings. There probably won't be but 4 or 5 more lessons after tonight to get us to understand the purpose, why the Federalist was written. And it's a good, if you want to read to help you understand our Constitution and how it came about and the reasons for it and the reasons it was adopted, the Federalist is a good place to go to read. It's not going to be exciting reading, but it's tonight we're going to probably touch on 4 of them because they're kind of grouped within that 85 about different stages, different points, and different arguments in order to convince people that this was a good Constitution. It was something that they could adopt. And it was not a foregone conclusion, as we have talked about earlier. So tonight, I want to start with Federalist 51. Considering we did 1 the last time, we're on 51. We've jumped a little, and I'll go back and touch on some of the others. But we're on 51, so I'll be mentioning 47, 48, 49, 50, and 51 in this particular grouping, and I think all of those were written by James Madison, and it's the separation of powers. So, to get us started, why was separation of powers important when they wrote the Constitution? Why is it important to us today? Why was it important then? You're not giving one person the power. You're not making one person a tyrant. Plus, you get to, each one balances the other as long as you keep them in check and keep them within power. And it starts, Federalist 51, like this. He says, "To what expedient then shall we finally resort for the maintaining in practice the necessary partition of power among the several departments as laid down in the Constitution?" And he says necessary partition. He said they saw it as being necessary that they do this. And I think I mentioned the last time, and I mentioned again, they had talked about, like with the executive branch, we have a president. And he's really the executive, the chief executive of the nation. And they had talked about making it like 3 people or 4 people or whatever. I don't remember how many different numbers they threw about. But can you imagine having 3 presidents and having them to try to agree on something? So anyway, I think it was a good idea that they didn't. They made the executive like it was. And the executive, what I mentioned, I think I mentioned this last week as well, the executive in general, this is an in general statement. When it comes to the executive, I would prefer, if it's going to be somebody who served in government, I'd rather it be a governor than for it to be a senator or a congressman of any kind, because they haven't served in an executive capacity, but a governor has. CEOs of companies have. Heads of organizations have served in an executive capacity, and executive is a different position than other people in an organization. They're the ones, we think of those as being at the top, but they're the ones that have to take what was passed over here, what laws are on the books, and put them into action and make them work and sort through all the different organizations and so on that it takes to get that done within the law that they have passed. So that makes a difference in the executive. But he made the assumption here, said the necessary partition. And the question is it necessary? As far as I'm concerned, yes, it is necessary, because we don't want one person to be a tyrant and one person to rule over us as they had under King George. Remember what they had come out from under when we became a free nation. And Revolutionary War started in like 1775, Declaration of Independence 1776. The Revolutionary War didn't end until 1783, I think. And from there until 1787, they were under the Articles of Confederation, which was a loosely knit group of colonies, of states, if you will. And they saw they needed something stronger than that. And so he's talking now about the powers that's going to be within. If you're going to put yourself under a government, do you want it to be under the power of one person, or do you want it to be under several different divisions and then balance each other? And so, yes, I think it's necessary. The only answer that can be given is that as all these exterior provisions, now keep in mind he was writing back in the 18th century, are found to be inadequate, the effect must be supplied by so contriving the interior structure of the government as that its several constituent parts may, by their mutual relations, be the means of keeping each other in their proper places. Did you catch all that? Well, they wrote a lot. People say that we're so much smarter today than they were back then. I don't believe it. The things that they wrote and the way that they expressed things were so much, it's above our heads in so many ways. But what he's saying here is, you've got to address this within the government and create a structure within the government that will take care of these problems that we have, and to help protect us from our government, as well as to supply us with a government that can do what's best for us. So they need some things within the government, and so that's the reason these particular papers that he's writing have to do with the separation of powers. And I put here that each one keeps a check on the other. Have legislative. This is rough sketch. Legislative passes the bills. The executive is the one that signs the bill, and it becomes law and does the practical things it takes to put it into effect. The judicial disputes under the law are what the judiciary decides. They have gotten a lot bigger than that over the years, and there's things that they do that is not within their purview to do. As far as I'm concerned, as far as the Constitution is concerned, they weren't given. Well, I won't get into that right now. Before I get into those, I want to talk about the other separations of power. We think of separation of power. We think of the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. That's the separation of powers. That's in the federal government. But there's other separations, and I put here the states and the people. And what's the main power that the states and the people have? Before we get there, let's look at Article 6 in the Constitution. It says this: "This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land." It said, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws or of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. So they're saying, he's saying that within this Constitution, or the Constitution is saying, that under this Constitution, when laws are passed, they're signed into being by the President, the executive branch. Once that's done, it goes to the House, then through the Senate, or the Senate and the House, and then goes to the President. And he signed it, it becomes laws, and every state within the Union is under those laws. You can't pass laws within your state that are against the laws that are passed on the federal level, and it has to be that way. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, now listen to this one: "The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislatures thereof." By who? What are we going through? What have we gone through for the last few years in North Carolina that would touch on this? I'll finish reading this. "But the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations." Who can alter it? Congress. Congress. It only states, they're the only ones. Congress can make alterations of it in place of choosing, and I did not misspell that. That's the way he spelled it. So they didn't spell exactly the same way that we do. So get back to what we're talking about here. What's prescribed by the state, something we've been going through. The state of North Carolina went through redistricting, and they created a map, a new map. The court struck it down. Did the court have any authority to strike it down according to the Constitution? far as I'm concerned, they had no authority whatsoever to strike down because who makes the decision? The legislatures of the state. And people say, well, the reason you say that is because it was a Republican House and Senate that drew up this map, so it's going to help the Republicans. And I would answer that by saying, and how many times was it changed in the past by Democrats and by Republicans? That's been happening ever since the Constitution has been in effect. They've been changing them. One reason we redistricted is because we got a new district. We got more representation. And so we had to redraw the districts in order to make them fit, to make them work. But what happened is like I said, they passed it, they drew up the maps, they put the maps, this is the maps, and then the court struck it down. They said, you can't do that. Well, there have been many rulings since then. So anyway, we're not following the Constitution when it comes to these things, and who's the only people who can make the difference in that? It's us. We have to pressure our elected officials and vote in the right one. Section 2, Article 1, Clause 2. Each state shall appoint. Each state shall, who? Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature of that state thereof may direct a number of electors. So what's it talking about here? Talking about the Electoral College. Okay, we just had a big fight after the 2020 election about the electors. Donald Trump was saying that, well, you need the state of this state needs to throw out those electors and send new electors. Can that be done? Under the Constitution, it can. Who has the authority to do it? The legislatures in the state. Do I think we should have done that this past election? No. It would have created a whole lot more grief than what we had. Do I think in this past election that there was some bad, dirty things that were done with the election? Yes. It has been with every election we've ever had. So, I mean, it wouldn't be any different in this particular one. So, yes, you could find things that were not right, things that should have been done differently, things that were not handled right. The people broke the law, just like they do at every election. There have been people arrested. They said, I've heard people say, there wasn't any fraud done whatsoever. I said, well, there's people that are in prison right now that would like to have known that because they went to prison for it. So, yes, they were. But the point I'm getting at is the state. We're talking about the separation of powers. Not only the separation of powers on the federal level between the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. That gives you a separation of powers, so they balance each other. But you also have a balancing between the federal government and the state government. There are certain things that the Constitution gives the state permission to do, or the authority to do, that the federal government can't do anything about. Period. They can't touch it, not supposed to. There are certain things that Congress is supposed to do, not the court. Certain things the court is supposed to do, not Congress. Certain things the executive is supposed to do, so on down the line. And when they overstep those, then that's when we create problems. In an anonymous exposition, John C. Calhoun, and you can read this, but I'll tell you what it's about. Before the Civil War, 1830s I think it was, John C. Calhoun came up with a theory. He wasn't the only one, but he's the one that spoke most forcibly in favor of it, was that each state had the authority to nullify whatever law the federal government passed that they didn't want to follow. He said that the Constitution was a compact between the states. Well, it was found that it was a contract, not a compact. And the Constitution established the states the way they were. Do I think the South had the legal authority under the Constitution to secede from the Union? No, I didn't. I don't think that at all, and I'm born and raised in the South. But there is no room in the Constitution for a state to secede or to nullify anything within the Constitution. The way you handle that is through legislation, through your elected officials, and so on. So, but anyway, he proposed this, and so, but what he was looking at, and they were arguing about, and was still arguing about today, is how much is states' rights, how much is federal rights. Well, state rights gives you another separation of powers from the within the government besides just on a federal level. Article 4. The Congress, whenever two-thirds, now listen to this one. The Congress, whenever two-thirds of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to the Constitution. Okay, we know that. You can amend the Constitution. It's been amended several times. Or on the application of the legislatures of two-thirds of several states shall call a convention for proposing amendments. So another separation of power, another power that we have over the federal government is that if two-thirds of the states shall petition the government, then they can call a constitutional convention and they can come up with amendments other than and bypass the legislature in the federal government. So there's another separation of powers there. And this is you can read this, but currently it takes 34 states in order to call a constitutional convention, and if they propose any amendments, it takes 38 states, 3/4 of them, in order to pass those. So you see, when they set up the Constitution, they set up in a way so that you have your separation of powers on a federal level, and then you have your separation of powers between the federal and the state, and there's another separation of powers. In our Constitution, what is the main power that the people have over government? The vote. What does it take in order to vote? You have to be a citizen. You have to be registered. What else should it take? Learn what is up for grabs. Learn what this person stands for. Learn what this person stands for. I'll vote for a particular person for office over another one, not because of just their character and their nature, but according to what they stand for and what they will get done. And I'll ask this question, and I think you all can understand where I'm coming from. It looks like the Democrat and Republican running in 2024 at the present time, it looks like it will be Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Does anybody in this room really think that's the two best men in the entire nation to be on the? I'm not picking on either one of them, but I don't think they're the two best choices on either side. So what do you do when it comes time? You have to make that decision, and we have to make an informed decision. It might not even be the two of them. They could both die before then. We don't know. There could many things come up. The more they indict Trump, the more his numbers, his approval rating goes up. You people just leave him alone is what you'll be a lot better off. You keep on messing around, you're going to get him elected president again, and you're trying to keep him from it. So anyway, and I won't get into what I think about all those because there's too much there. So we won't go that far. But what we have to do, another separation of powers, is we, the people of the United States, can vote in and vote out people for office. We have the power of the vote. We just have to use it and use it wisely. If you don't vote, then don't complain. What's that? Vote or don't complain. But truth is, if you well, there's so many things, but if you compare our constitutional system to perfection, how does it fare? But if you compare it to everybody else's, how does it compare? So we're not going to have a perfect Constitution. We're not going to have a perfect president. We're not going to have a perfect Congress or judiciary. We're not even perfect people ourselves. But we have to have so what he's reasoning about here is that we're not going to have a perfect system, but this is the way that the Constitution calls to help keep the powers in check. So, Federalist 51, the only answer that can be given is that as all these exterior, and we read all this before, so what he's saying is we have to do some things inside the government in order to protect us from the government, and that has to do with separation of powers. And like I said, you can read these in the 47th, 48th, 49th, 50th, and 51st Federalist paper, give all of his reasoning, and it would take you a while, but it's good reasoning. In framing of a government, which is to be administered by men over men. Now, this is part of what he wrote in 51. That's the reason I wanted to start with 51 here. By men over men, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. And that's the way he spelled control, by the way. Control itself. A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government. So we are the primary control. But experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. Now, this is the line that... Is this the one? Anyway. But it is not possible to give to each department the equal power of self-defense. In Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. In other words, he's saying the legislative wing is going to dominate. Why is that? Can the president write a bill? He can write one, but if they don't want to take it up in the House or the Senate, it can't go anywhere. He can't start a bill and make them vote on his bill. Now, they have some control over what bills are presented, but the legislature is going to predominate. So he can say that. So what do you do if you know the legislature is going to be the most powerful? What do you do with it? So the remedy for this inconveniency is to divide the legislature into different branches. So what do we have in our country in the legislature? We have a Senate and we have a House. How do you elect the House? Every 2 years, every seat is up for election. Every 2 years. And the House, the way you decide how many House members you have is based on your population. The Senate is every 6 years, but not all 6 of them go out at the same time. It's staggered. And so it's every 6 years. And at the time of the Constitution, the state legislatures appointed the 2 senators. You didn't get to vote on them. And it was amended later to where you got to vote. We got to vote on them. So it's a different way that they're selected, a different number there, and there's 2 from every state. Every state has 2 senators. We have states that have 2 senators, but yet only have enough population to have 1 House member. So they have more. What does that do? That helps make everybody equal, every state equal to some degree. But yet, it also gives the higher population, the more people that you have, the more representation you get in the House of Representatives, so you have a little more pull when it comes to that. So it's a balancing mechanism that helps you be able to balance out the power of either one. So nobody dominates. There are moreover 2 considerations particularly applicable to the federal system of America, which place that system in a very interesting point of view. It places in the point of view. First, there's something I missed here. Did I jump something? I wanted a quote there that I think I might have missed. Maybe not. Maybe I haven't gotten to it yet. Pardon me? I did somewhere. I just got to figure out where in the world it is. Okay. We'll get past that. If I run across the quote, if I don't, I'll tell you what it is. I got to find out where I was now. First, he says, the single republic all the power surrendered by the people is submitted to the administration of a single government, and usurpations are guarded against by a division of government into distinct and separate departments. So it's saying first you have a single republic, but it's divided into parts, is what it's saying. Then he says, second, he says to guard the society against the oppression of its rulers, but to guard one part of the society against another. In other words, he's going into detail, and he goes on and on and on. If you read these and read what he says about the reasoning that they went through when they were discussing it. Think about it. Put yourself in the position of these men that were together trying to come up with a constitution for their nation. And the processes that you'd have to go to. First thing, can you imagine getting 50 plus people to agree on something? Can you imagine the arguments they had? And not only did they have the regular sessions, but a lot of it happened after the sessions. They'd meet in the different places, and they'd talk over things, and they'd bring it back the next day. But getting people to agree on something, getting 50-some people to agree on anything as important, as momentous as this, would be difficult to do. But that's what they were up against, and so he's trying to explain to the people of New York, why is it you need to ratify this thing? Federalist 47, 48, 49, 50, and 51 all deal with the separation of powers. So we'll give you a quick, brief synopsis. In 47, Madison's goal was to show that the principle of separation of powers did not require absolute separation. In other words, they don't have to be completely 100% separated in order for this to work. It says some were inclined to hold that Montesquieu's separation of powers was at odds with our Constitution. Madison was pointing out that no, it was not different. And you'll see in just a second. 48, the conclusion that a mere demarcation on parchment of the constitutional limits of several departments is not sufficient guard against those encroachments. What's he saying? You can put it on paper all you want to. You can write it in stone if you want to. Look what God did when He gave the Israelites the law. He carved it in stone, and they still didn't follow it. So you can't make people follow it because it's on paper. And we see that happening today in the things that's going on and how they're not following the Constitution when they should be. Is not sufficient guard against those encroachments which lead to a tyrannical concentration of all the powers of government in the same hands. In other words, we're trying to keep this from all winding up in one group of people's hands. What is a tyranny? I think I might have put the definition down here somewhere. What's a tyranny? If you had to define it. Pardon me? It's the authoritarian type government, whether it be one person or a handful of people or whatever, they force their will upon everybody else. That's a tyrannical form of government. So they're trying to protect against that, and they were working hard to do it. Federalist 49, we found in the last paper that mere declarations in the written Constitution are not sufficient to restrain the several departments within their legal rights. So he's going through a series of things here. He's saying just writing it down is not going to make it. He said, I've already shown you in the one before this that just writing it down is not going to take care of it. It may be contended that perhaps that instead of occasional appeals to the people, which are liable to be objections urged against them, periodical appeals are the proper and adequate means of preventing and correcting infractions of the Constitution. Okay, so what he's saying was, if I'll try to put this the way I would put it, is why is it the people can't just go tell listen, this is the way we want you to do it. We don't want you to do it this way. We want you to change it. We want you to make it this way. Why wouldn't that work? How many people are in the United States right now? About 340 million. Can you imagine 340 million? If everybody just wrote down on a piece of paper what you wanted your government to do. That'd be 340 million pieces of paper. They're going to be of them alike. Madison recognizes in this and previous papers the value of holding government accountable to the people. Government must be accountable to the people, or it becomes a tyranny. It becomes tyrannical. However, he asserts that the kind of public censoring proposed here will be ultimately ineffective. In other words, all the people can't voice their opinions all the time and change it in that way. Although an advocate of separation of powers and checks and balances, this is one check on government power that Madison does not support. In other words, of all the people being the balancing portion that creates the separation of powers that keeps them from being too powerful, it's the people. Well, the people, our part is what? To vote, to talk to our elected representatives, to find out what they stand for, find out what they do, find out what legislation they support, what they don't support. And so what they tell you they support, what they tell you they'll do, is not what most of them do. They want to tell you what they want you to think that they will do so that you'll elect them. Federalist number 47. Having reviewed the general form of the proposed government and the general mass of power allotted to it, I proceed to examine the particular structure of this government and the distribution of this mass of power among its constituent parts. He says, the oracle who is always consulted is Montesquieu, who is a French philosopher, as it says here. But he argued from what he used for his documentation was the British Constitution. What was different about the British Constitution? See if I put it here. Madison agrees with these, and we can skip that one. Tyranny. I've got the official definition of tyranny here. Government by a ruler or small group of people who have unlimited power over the people in their country or state and use it unfairly and cruelly. That's what they're fighting against. His separation of powers was based on the British model, and the problem with the British model was, let's see if I've got it in here, yeah. He, the executive, talking about the monarch, under the British Constitution. At the time of our Constitution, it was a constitutional monarchy is basically what they had. Alone was a prerogative of making treaties with foreign sovereigns. In other words, it's saying the king can make treaties with foreign governments, and he doesn't have to get the approval of anybody in order to do that. And once he makes those agreements, in effect, it becomes law. That's what it says. All the members of the Judiciary Department are appointed by him. In other words, all the judiciary are appointed by the executive. And they can be removed by the executive. Can you imagine how it would be today if the President of the United States appointed all of the judges and kicked out the ones he wanted to kick out, and then would there be any separation of powers there? What he's saying is this is not the way ours is working. It's a much different system, regardless of what any philosopher or anybody else says. We don't want that kind of government. We don't want one man having that much power. Instead of having equal branches under the British Constitution, one branch has much more authority than the others, and that's so true. Madison continues by comparing some of the constitutions of the other states. What we don't see a lot of times is there were several states who had written their own constitutions after we were free from England, and they took all these together and looked at those and used parts of some of them and so on when they were writing our national constitution. So he brings those up as well, and he's saying where the defects are in some of those, and he mentions some of those in these 47, 48, 49, 50, and 51. What I wish to evince is that the charge brought against the proposed Constitution of violating a sacred maxim of free government is warranted neither by the real meaning annexed to that maxim by its author, nor by the sense in which it has hitherto been understood in America. This interesting subject will be resumed in the ensuing papers. In other words, he said, I've got more to say about all this. And we know he does because there's 85 of them. The quote that I didn't see in there that I thought I'd put in there, Madison made a comment that was so telling. He said, if men were angels, you wouldn't need a constitution. Oh, did I go by it? Okay. If men were angels, you wouldn't need a constitution. You wouldn't need these laws because we would just obey them anyway. Men are not angels. Did you know that? We're not perfect. There's many things that we get wrong. But what they were trying to do, what he's trying to show in these particular writings is that we've done he's telling the people, and he's not telling by name because these all were written under the name Publius. So they don't know it was years later before they were able to figure out which ones Alexander Hamilton wrote, which ones James Madison wrote, which ones John Jay wrote. And some of them still argue over, some of them say they don't think it was this one or that one, but I think they got it pretty well down. But what they're trying to do is create a system where, and what they're arguing in all these, or what he's arguing in all these is, we need a separation of powers. Anytime you have an organization that's controlled by one person, how's the government of Mount Zion Church set up? Who gets to make all the decisions? There is no one person that gets to make all the decisions. And that's the way you want it to be. If you all wanted me to stay here as pastor and said, we're going to give you all the authority, I say, well, I'm going to go somewhere else. I don't want all the authority. I don't want to make all the decisions. I don't want to do, well, there's a selfish reason for that too, because if I make all the decisions, then I can get blamed for everything that goes wrong. I don't want that kind of burden, and nobody should have that. I told the church here when I came here, I said, I don't want, because they knew that Diana was in accounting. I said, she's not going to handle anything to do with the money. I don't want to see what happens with the money. Have I ever asked anybody to see what the books say and what somebody gives in the church? I've never asked, don't want to know. I don't want to know any of that, because that can influence how I look at different people, because I'm human. So I don't need to know that. So that's what he's arguing is, we need it separated so that no one part can dominate the others. Through history, different branches have pulled out ahead and began to dominate others more than at other times, and that's not good. I think it's still unbalanced to some degree, but that's for a different time. Any questions?